draws on the internet.
Trying to identify the books that are on your, well, there's obviously variations of your own book, Loonshots, paperback. Well,
This is Dutch. It's now in like 21. This is Dutch. They have, I really like their cover. It's kind of funky.
it's funny how the covers are always different cultures, right?
Yeah.
Titles. Well, not your
This
title,
is,
I guess. Anyway, what else is on your shelf below the?
well, that's Churchill.
Yeah.
This was stuff for some of the Charles Lindbergh. I love this biography by Scott Berg. It's really such a fascinating book. This was on one
I
trip.
haven't read it, but
This,
I heard about, yeah.
yeah, I mean, he's such a good writer. This is a really good biography if you're a physicist of the four people behind QED, quantum electrodynamics, Feynman, Schwinger, Tominaga, and Dyson. But a really interesting story, although you might need to be a bit of a physics geek. But the guy is a real physicist, so it's not like one of these fake histories. And then a couple other nice science books. And then actually the writer that I use to kind of get inspired about writing, which is Nabokov. Some sort of
Nabokov, interesting.
yeah.
Why Nabokov? And which book did you like most? Pnin?
I actually don't read much fiction or spend much time on fiction because when I'm reading, I'm mostly reading for ear, for rhythm and craft and how you structure not only sentences but transitions, paragraphs, and flow and descriptions. And he's just stunning in his ability to do that in a way that he makes it seem effortless and original and fresh, things that are otherwise kind of boring and tired. And I don't think I've read anyone else that is able to do that at that level. Is kind of one, but also I enjoyed his kind of attitude. He's just having fun with it. He's clearly writing for entertaining himself. He's not writing with any big message. He's not writing with, let me convince you of X. He doesn't really give a shit what any of his critics thinks. He just wants to make something beautiful. And that was advice that stayed with me a long time with a writer friend when I started. He said, don't worry about anything else. Just make something beautiful. And that actually is, I've found, been very helpful advice along the way. And I think that's what resonated for me about Nabokov. He didn't really care about anything other than trying to make something beautiful.
Yeah, it's interesting that you have to teach yourself how to write. I mean, you're a CEO, an entrepreneur, a physicist, right? But then writing is a completely different thing. And Thomas Mann once said, a writer is someone for whom writing is incredibly hard. And I thought that's a really beautiful quote. I mean, it's such an honest craft, and you have to really teach yourself, and you get just better and better at it, I guess, if it's practice.
Yeah, I think, I have a lot of business types who approach me later and say, oh, hey, you wrote this book. It was like, it's all over, sounds easy. How do I do it? Let me do it. I want to do it. I was like, well, you can't do it part-time. It was a 2-year, 8 a.m. to midnight commitment. There was research that was extremely intense. Then there was drafting, then there was editing, but also it's like playing basketball. It's like these guys play a game. They don't just go and play games. They will spend 6 hours just shooting free points, doing free throws or doing 3 points over and over and over and over. So unless you find that fun, which I did actually, it's not, you're not going to enjoy the process.
Let's talk about your book, Loonshots, widely acclaimed, wonderful book. Maybe let's start by explaining the difference between what most people are familiar with, a moonshot, and the difference to a loonshot.
Well, everybody does know what a moonshot is. It's this big goal that everyone gets excited about. And it came from when John F. Kennedy in 1962 told the American people, we're going to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. And so that became a term. Let's put a man on the moon. Everybody was excited about that. But if you look back at the course of science or business or even world history, the big ideas, the one that change industries or cure diseases, almost never arrive with these big blaring trumpets and red carpets dazzling everybody. with how wonderful those ideas are, they're usually dismissed for years or decades, and their champions are written off as crazy. And since there wasn't a good word in the English language for that, I made one up.
You say basically that when you innovate or in the development of any organization, at some point there's a conflict between stake and rank. And for small groups, the incentive is they have a stake, so they're very motivated to be innovative and open. Then the further the organization grows, right, rank becomes more important, and actually the incentive is to preserve the status quo and actually not take a risk necessarily to innovate. And then you borrow from the physics and you talk about what you call the physical concept of phase transition and dynamic equilibrium. Can you explain what you mean by that and how phase transitions help us become better at innovation?
Sure. And the reason it matters, anyone who is managing a business, running a business, leading a department knows there's so much stuff there about culture. But that's not really as important as the point that I read about in Loonshot as structure. And you can think of that not as two things that are opposed, and I explain what I mean by that, but you can think of structure as what drives culture. And here's an example. This is a glass of water. And when I stick my finger in and twirl it around, all the molecules inside the glass of water just slosh around my finger. And then as I lower the temperature at 0 degrees Celsius, all of a sudden the behavior of those molecules, they go from sloshing around and being wild and free, completely changes. They line up rigidly. Why? Those molecules are exactly the same, but suddenly they changed behavior. As soon as I lower the temperature, the water freezes. And so what I show in Loonshots is why that happens and how understanding why that happens, which is called the phase transitions, helps us understand why good companies will suddenly change, why they'll fall off a cliff, why Merck, for example, can develop great, fantastic drugs for 20 years and then nothing happens, why Disney can do all these great movies for 20 years and then suddenly decline, why Nokia became the most valuable company in Europe at 300 billion in market cap and then shot down the ideas for a smartphone. It helps you understand why the good teams can kill great ideas, why companies that have been successful for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, something can suddenly change. The temperature crosses this tipping point, this phase transition, and the same people who were embracing wild new ideas begin to kill them, which comes down to the two forces that you mentioned. A phase transition, and this is like every phase transition in nature explained in 90 seconds. Every phase transition, the sudden change of a large system like that glass of water, is the result of two competing forces, a tug of war. In the case of a glass of water, one of those forces is called entropy, which is just a fancy word meaning run around and be free. And another force is called binding energy, which just wants to lock every molecule rigidly in place 2.8 angstroms from its neighbor, not 2.7 or 2.9. And when you have a high temperature, entropy wins. And then as you lower the temperature, boom, right at 0 degrees Celsius, whoosh, the balance of forces shifts and all of a sudden binding energy wins, and that's why the system suddenly changes. Now, the same thing happens inside teams and companies. You might say, well, this sounds like a crazy idea. All people are different, all teams are different, all nations are different, and that's certainly true. But so are all liquids. Water is different than coffee, is different than orange juice, but they all freeze. And that's the important insight, that there are properties of the whole that don't depend on the details on the part. Liquids always freeze. They do this transition. Companies will always do this transition. But the key is, once you understand it, you can begin to manage it. With water, you can sprinkle, when it snows overnight, you sprinkle salt on the sidewalks. Why? Because it lowers the binding energy. So when you wake up in the morning and you step on your sidewalk, you wet your shoe in a puddle instead of slipping on ice and ending up in the hospital. You've lowered the binding energy. You've made the molecules more likely to slosh around and be free. You've made it more want to be liquid. And that's what you can do with teams and companies once you understand the dynamics of this transition. So what is it? How does it work? Whenever you create a team, a group, any kind of organization where there's a mission and a reward system tied to that mission, you've just created two competing forces. The first, as you said, is your personal stake in outcome. When you're, let's say, a 10-person biotechnology company like I was running, or BioNTech over in Germany, everybody's stake in outcome is enormous. If that product works, everyone's a hero and a millionaire, like they are in Germany now. And if it fails, you're unemployed and looking for a new job. What does that mean? Well, it means anyone who's working anything entrepreneurial needs to understand, and this is the starting point, that most good ideas look crazy. They fail many times before they succeed. mRNA failed many, many, many times before it succeeded. And what happens is when everybody's stake in outcome is high, they roll up their sleeves together and save it. They fix those problems. Now, let's say you're at a 100,000 person company, Pfizer, for example. When that same project usually comes in, now, of course, Pfizer's done a very good job in licensing and partnering with the mRNA companies, especially biotech. When that project comes in, typically people sit around a conference table, you're at a committee meeting, and they say, well, what's my stake in outcome in this product? You might move the equity of, Pfizer sales are $50 billion a year. If it sells, it might sell a few hundred million, for a small period of time. My stake in outcome isn't going to be so high. But if I can stand good at a committee meeting, if I say, well, they didn't do this and they didn't do that, and I say what my boss at the table wants to hear, my boss at the table might be going, that young fellow is right. And then her boss is sitting there and saying, oh, that young fellow is right. They didn't do this thing on page 87 of the PowerPoint. They didn't do it quite right. They didn't do that experiment. They didn't dot this I. They didn't do this analysis. This young fellow really knows what he's talking about. Might get promoted. All of a sudden, your stake in outcome is tiny, but your perks of rank are high. In between the two is a phase transition. When you go from a small company where everybody's stake is dominant and perks of rank don't matter, are you the vice president, the assistant vice president? If it's a 10-person company, are you kidding? Who cares what your title is? Now, if you're at a 100,000 person company, if you're an assistant vice president or a vice president or a senior vice president, it makes a very big difference, more than your stake in outcome. So that's how understanding the same two dynamics, the two dynamics that describe every phase transition, can be applied to understanding the dynamics inside companies. Now, there's a lot more to it, obviously, and there's a lot more detail that, when I talk to executive teams and companies, there's much more to it, but that's kind of the gist of it.
Well, let's apply that theory to the epitome of a loonshot that we're witnessing this year. Of course, is the development of a COVID vaccine. A couple of days ago, the first British person was vaccinated with the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine, so a so-called mRNA vaccine. That was really laughed at, right? The idea of mRNA. That was a crazy idea, but it's been around, I understand, for many, many years. Why now? Why this breakthrough now? Is it the urgency of the moment, or what led Pfizer or Moderna and BioNTech? What made it happen in such record pace?
What's so exciting about mRNA is that it's one example of a different kind of approach to medicine. And that is, you ask, well, where, and this is what, a woman who now works at biotech is one of the people who had the idea. And of course, there were many people who contributed along the way, but she really pioneered the technology that is used both by the Pfizer BioNTech drug as well as the Moderna drug. Where do these robots come from in humans? Turns out you have little 3D printers inside you, little factories that make the robots. You feed those little 3D printers a piece of paper, an instruction sheet, and boom, out pops the robot. And that's what mRNA does. It's just an instruction sheet. It's not actually the drug. And it goes into the factory inside a cell, and boom, out pops a robot that starts working. And that's what the mRNA vaccines do. Instead of actually, the reason that they were so fast, the reason that they're before the Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca and other vaccines, is they're not the vaccine. They're the instruction, the software code, the genetic software code for making it inside the 3D printers in your body. Instead of just injecting a robot, we teach the body to fix itself. We alter the genetic code, or we feed the genetic instructions. So what I think is so exciting about the mRNA is that it represents kind of a third wave of medicine of teaching the body to fix itself instead of injecting with the traditional drugs.
Now, as an entrepreneur, as a physicist, as the author of Loonshots, Safi, talking about mRNA and the vaccination, how do you foresee the rollout? How optimistic are you that we can return to a sense of normalcy next year? And then maybe the second question, the success of mRNA, if it'll prove to be successful, will it inoculate us? I mean, will it help us to respond to future viruses much, much faster? Is it really a game changer?
Well, I'll take the second question first. Yes, it is a game changer. As you can see right now, it's just faster because you skip a manufacturing step. What we did not know, what nobody knew at the beginning of this year, was whether it would work. And if it did work, how well would it work? Because there's never been an approach like that worked before, which is normal. Every time you try something new, it's just a probability. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And the reason, I was quite optimistic in the beginning of this year, and many people who have been in the biotech industry for many years were similarly optimistic, is not because we thought approach A would work or approach B would work, but because of the portfolio. There's now 200 vaccines or so in various stages of development, 60 in clinical trials. They're all different. And that's what happens when you have very different approaches. Some work and some don't. You don't really know in advance. But the fact that you have so many shots on goal is why many of us were optimistic. And you asked about next year. I'm very optimistic that we will return to normal, not just because the first two vaccines looked good, but because there's 10 more coming. And if any problems, things in drug development always have ups and downs. They look good, then they look bad, then they look good, then they look bad. If any problems happen with these ones, we have 10 more coming, all of which are different, and many of which are easier to deliver and administer because these required a cold chain, very, very cold refrigerators to deliver. And traditional vaccines, which are coming a few months later, don't need those. So I'm optimistic we will get back to normal. And the approach has taught us that it works, and it's relatively easy because you just need the genetic code of the virus and you plug it into the 3D printer and there it goes.
Do you have a personal Loonshot for next year?
Well, I think, yeah, you asked me earlier what was one of the biggest Loonshots that I worked on. Well, I was thinking about it, and when I set out to write this book, almost every publisher said, you tell these historical stories of 17th century astronomy and the rise of digital cameras and Steve Jobs and submarines, and you try to mix that with physics. Like, that doesn't work when you mix physics and business, and history. Like, those books don't work. And I remember thinking, those books, could you show me an example? Because I don't really remember reading books like that. But that was a crazy idea. People said there's no way that would work. And in the future, I've got a couple other crazy ideas that I'm working on. And for humanity, I think one of the most interesting crazy ideas is, can we reverse aging? And there are a number of biotechs working on that now and have been making some very interesting progress.
Safi, thanks very much for your time.
Absolutely.